Coney House, London, calling.
And still to come, 100 years since the first official BBC broadcast a radio news bulletin. The BBC is celebrating the 100th anniversary of its first official BBC broadcast, a radio news bulletin from London, and the presenter would have talked into a microphone a bit like this one, though this is later, from the early 1940s. That first broadcast included a report on a court proceedings at the Old Bailey, details of disruption caused by fog in the capital and the billiard scores. Our correspondent David Silito has more.
Hello, 2LO calling, 2LO calling.
November the 14th, 1922, and the beginning of the BBC. 2LO was the call sign of the BBC station in London. And 100 years on, the 6 o'clock radio news has been marking how it all began.
This bulletin marks the moment 100 years ago that the BBC began broadcasting.
Back in 1922, the newsreader at 6 p.m. was Arthur Burrows.
Arthur Burrows, at this point, is the first voice of the BBC. He's almost had the idea of broadcasting a few years earlier as well. And within a month, he'll be director of programmes at the BBC and one of our first children's presenters.
Yes, Arthur was also Uncle Arthur, children's entertainer. It wasn't a large organisation on day one. How many staff at the beginning in November 1922?
November 1922, the BBC has a staff of 0. There are no employees.
No official staff.
There are no official staff. Arthur Burrows does that first broadcast essentially in his spare time.
Was it just London in November 1922?
No, London was day one, and then day two was Birmingham and Manchester. And that's where you get musical concerts, children's programmes come in there, the general election results as well, all mixed in together.
For them as likes London, I suppose it's all right.
And the BBC has only now been discovering just how many of its pioneering programmes came from Manchester and Birmingham.
Wherever to you, Birmingham.
It's adding details to its online Radio Times history about satire, concerts. And this is Puppy from the children's programme from Glasgow. But it began with the news, and it was nerve-wracking. Arthur Burrows later wrote he could think of no more exacting a test of physical fitness than the reading of a news bulletin. David Silito, BBC News.
I think you might have been overstating it a little bit, but I know someone who is fit as a flea, and that is Louise Lear. Louise, tell us about the weather.
I don't think so. Running around all the time. I tell you what, 100 years ago we had fog in London, and look at this. It's almost as though we planned it. Yes, it's been a foggy day. A real November morning this morning, wasn't it? Grey and gloomy for many of us. Really quite damp out there as well with that fog.